John Watson is coming back from Afghanistan. In BBC's Sherlock Holmes, John Watson is coming back from Afghanistan. And you're like, fuck. The Graveyard of Empires. Welcome to the Skippy and Fanty Show, Torture Cinema.
Wolverines!
Oh, God.
I told you there's only one tagline that fits for this movie, and that's it.
That's the obvious one.
Yes, correct. That is how this movie is. It's obvious.
I'm Alex.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Paul.
And on today's show, we'll discuss 1984's I'm Not Reading That war movie, Red Dawn, written by John Milius and Kevin Reynolds, also directed by John Milius, and starring Patrick Swayze, Charlie Sheen, Leah Thompson, Jennifer Grey, and C. Thomas Howell. This was, as always, selected by our Patreon supporters who decided we should watch this even though Armageddon was right there. Come on, people. They light a fire in space. But instead, you made me watch this shit that was masterminded by General Alexander Haig.
I may have voted for this film. I don't remember.
Paul.
Oh, Paul. Look, this is once more confirming what I have always known, which is I can predict nothing about our patron supporters because they just never choose the film that I think is obvious. I thought Armageddon for sure was going to win. I did not expect that we would be talking about Red Dawn. Of the list of films that was there, this is not the one that I thought was going to even come second. And yet here we are.
Yeah. I mean, we could have talked about Armageddon, but I wouldn't want to miss a thing.
Oh,
sorry.
But no, instead we get to watch a movie that doesn't even have its own theme song.
It's a shame.
Which is very un-80s of it.
That's pretty true. Yeah, there should have been a plucky 80s tune before all the paratroopers showed up.
Or like, like a 80s hair band anthem or something.
Like Anthrax should have done the song.
This movie takes itself way too seriously.
Well, and you couldn't have had Anthrax because that's devil worshipper music right there.
Oh, yeah, a film this conservative could not have devil worshipper music, so I guess it would have to be, you couldn't have a hair... What hair band is appropriate for conservatives of the 1980s? Like, they're all nonconformists, they all are, have their lady hair,
Yeah, you're right, and you couldn't have pop either because the 80s were a very bisexual decade for pop, which is very also unconservative. It would have had to be, Christian rock or something, which would have just...
Was Christian rock a thing in the 80s?
I mean, it probably existed, but I don't know if it was, Amy Grant wasn't, a thing yet.
Yeah, just like the conservatives don't have very many good movies, they don't have a whole lot of good bands, so there you go.
Yeah, who's the Morrissey of the 1980s?
Because Jurassic Play wasn't till, the 90s, so I don't know.
So I don't know, look, this leads us to the next thing I have to do in the script, which is about you all leaving us comments. But I honestly want to know, from your perspectives as listeners, who do you think was the conservative appropriate band that could have done a theme song for Red Dawn of the 1980s?
Because remember, for the specification, considering who was involved in the making of this movie, it cannot be no pinko commies. None. And none of them queers either. It has to be some red-blooded Americans, and Toby Keith wasn't there yet.
Well, anyway, before we get to drinking, summary, all that stuff, reminder, we do want to hear from you, skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. We're working on a mailbag episode, but we would love to hear your thoughts on this discussion point we just had, because it's silly, and that's what this show's about. So, with that in mind, we now need to move to what we're drinking. And so, Paul, I throw it to you first. What beverage are you drinking at this moment?
I am drinking the happiest beverage there is. I mean, they don't mention that New York City gets nuked in this. They talk about other cities being nuked. But I'm imagining Red Dawn, New York City probably get nuked. But I'm drinking the happiest beverage there is straight out of New York City. It is made out of chocolate syrup, seltzer, and half and half. Ooh. Do you know what that's called?
Oh, it's an egg cream, right?
Yes! Ding, ding,
yes!
ding! Alex gets it in one. I am drinking an egg cream with real Fox You Bet syrup from New York City. Okay, so what are you drinking, Alex?
So I am drinking a Cerveza Zalupes, which is a golden ale from Salupa's Beer Company, based out of Colorado. This is wonderful because this particular golden ale is influenced by the Aguas Frescas.
Ooh.
So it's got mango and lemon peel in it, and it honors the brewer's personal experiences in Mexico with Aguas Frescas. And I did this, of course, in honor of how fucking racist this movie was. Oh, and I'm sorry. What about you, Sean? I don't give a Sean, I don't give a shit what you're drinking.
Well, I didn't have any Fireball, and so I was going to try to make something that was like cinnamony, but also bright red to drink and then call it a Red Dawn, because then that would be themed to this movie. But I don't have that, and so I made something else that is fine, but it definitely is missing what I think Fireball would have added to this in terms of class. And so this is what I'm calling for now Red Dawn number 1, which features citron vodka. It's got Campari. It has a maraschino liqueur and Cointreau and a little bit of grenadine in it. And that's what I'm drinking. And I've made a double because being drunk is the point.
All right. So now for the main event, we're going to talk about Red Dawn. I have overruled Sean and asserted that I will do the summary because I do not trust him after things he said off the pod. So, Red Dawn is a film that I feel like actually a little background is worthwhile, because initially it was conceived of as a kind of like almost anti-war smaller art house film that then MGM picked it up, and particularly a person on the board of MGM, General Alexander Haig, got really excited about it. If that name isn't familiar to you, you should know that he was the chief of staff for Nixon and Ford, and he was Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, so that should tell
I'm
you
in
a
charge
lot.
here, man.
Mm-hmm. And he decided that it would be really awesome to bring in a conservative think tank to help figure out how to really, I guess, do a good invasion of America by Russia and really just like conservative this shit up. And then we got the movie that we got instead, which is in fact about Russia with Cuba and Nicaragua, ? Deciding to invade America. They invade the Western United States. I'm sure we're going to talk more about this later. And they end up, this is all focused on this fictional town in Colorado that supposedly guards this pass through the Rocky Mountains that's very important. More on that later, perhaps, too. And so that's why Russia and Nicaragua and Cuba land a bunch of paratroopers in there, and then they just occupy the town and murder a bunch of people, and everything's terrible, and a group of teenagers led by Patrick Swayze escapes them and goes up into the mountains and basically conducts a guerrilla war against these Russians and Nicaraguans and Cubans, and that's pretty much the film. Like, it's a lot of kids kind of pretending to be Rambo and blowing up tanks, and at some point there's a United States pilot that gets shot down that they find. So they find out about the further situation, about how much of the United States has been taken over, which is like half of it. Apparently they've made it into Kansas, but more on the geography of that later as well. And then a bunch of people die, and they die gloriously, and then they protect truth, justice, and the American way, and it's entirely imperialist propaganda. It's really a lot.
So I'm kind of reminded of the way you described this and how it got changed. Have either of you seen The Player?
I have not.
9.
Okay, so the player is stars Tim Robbins as a studio executive, and this writer brings in this small film, and it's going to have a dark ending, and he buys it and basically changes it into a major blockbuster where the entire premise of the film gets rewritten completely to the reverse of what he was going for. And then you're describing how this started as an art house movie that was going to be anti-imperialist and got turned into its exact evil giant opposite. I just thought, oh, this is kind of like what The Player did with its movie within a movie.
Yeah. It really did.
It's also worth pointing out, this is the same year that the modern adaptation of 1984 came out.
Oh, the British one, right?
Yeah. With William Hurt, I believe.
Yeah.
In the title, the main role of 1984.
We Are the Dead.
And so in the same year as this movie, which is Alex, it puts it very aggressively, and I think Alex, you are correct. But this is a very conservative movie in its presentation, not only of war, but how you would deal with a war. There is a film that is about like the exact opposite of like here is actually us criticizing totalitarian governments entirely in the same era, in the same year. I mean, there's a lot that you could say about like the political position of this movie, which is it is so much of its time that
Yes.
when they remade this movie in, I want to say like 2011.
It was 2012. It was 2012. Because if you look up Red Dawn, one of the top search terms is, why does Red Dawn 2012 not make any sense?
Well, there's a reason for it, and that is in large part because in 1984, it would be obvious to anybody familiar with that time period that Russia, or what was then called the Soviet Union, was not friends with the United States. Now, to be fair, it's not very much friends with us now, but it's a little bit different today.
Yeah, but at least it was Cold War. We were threatening to murder each other.
Yeah,
Like, okay.
not just murder. Nuke each other into oblivion, I
Yeah.
think would be the appropriate terminology.
Like, I'm gonna make fun of this movie a lot, but it does exemplify a lot of the fears of the Cold War, which we have thankfully moved on past.
I agree. Yeah, and I think it stands out that when they remake this movie, it lacks any of the same kind of political messaging that this film has, which this film, it would be fair to say, is problematic in the messaging that it offers. But it is at least dealing with what was an actual legitimate fear, which was actual war with the Soviet Union, whereas like the idea that people in 2012 were deeply concerned about some sort of World War III scenario with North Korea is absolutely absurd. But there is, of course, a different political context for why that film exists, which is largely the cowardice on the part of Hollywood to just tell Chinese censors to go fuck themselves, which didn't necessarily exist in 1984. This film also is like super based in Reagan era conservatism.
Oh yeah.
In some very distinct ways. And if anyone's watched this and be like, but it's not really a conservative movie, I just want you to know that the National Review considers it the 15th greatest conservative movie ever made. And that is because in large part, this film is literally like the mythos of like the idea of the revolutionary revolt against mass oppression by an evil enemy. And that is a deep conservative myth that falls apart once you realize that, especially today, like conservative notion of collective action basically doesn't exist. And so the idea that a bunch of teenagers would work together collectively to help fight against a massive invasion from a foreign enemy is so absurd just on its face in contemporary context. But in 1984, it was a thing that people thought would really happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is like in the entire. I was watching it the whole time, and I was like, "This is a 3%er wet dream movie." Like,
yes, it is.
It is like every militia nutbag in Idaho. Probably they love it. There is literally, y'all. If you have not seen this movie, there is literally a scene at the beginning when the invasion has been taken place where you see like a Chevy, I don't think it's a pickup truck, it's like an SUV or something, but it's got a bumper sticker on it that says like, they can have my gun when they take it from my cold dead hands. And they literally show a dead guy on the ground next to the truck holding a gun, and one of the soldiers comes over and takes the gun from his cold dead hands. I'm not even
the movie is not subtle in any way.
No. Yeah, arguably that may be one of its greatest faults is its total lack of any subtlety for a film that originally was intended as an anti-war film and then became like a conservative wet dream of a war film.
Yeah, they apparently they decided they were like, oh, we want to make it like Rambo, but with teenagers, and I'm like, oh, you are also missing the point of Rambo, but okay.
Well, especially the first Rambo, which is like Rambo is a tragic figure in the first film precisely because he has been he's been used in an imperialistic effort on the part of the United States, and then he comes home and everyone shits on him. And he just snaps because he's been in this situation doing horrible things for his country. Then he comes home and finds out his country hates him. And it's like, oh, what the fuck am I supposed to do? And then he snaps and murders a bunch of local police officers, which, you know.
I'm pretty sure that Rambo fans just pretend the first Rambo movie never existed and they start with Rambo 2.
Which is sad because Rambo, like the first one is really good.
Yeah, it's a 70s criticism of imperialism and what war does to people, and I mean what we would now call PTSD and trauma and all sorts of things. Yes, but I think it's just been excised from the Rambo mythos as, no, that didn't happen. Rambo just goes overseas and kicks butt.
Because I want to say, wasn't the first movie actually based on a novel?
Correct. Yeah.
Because I want to say my best friends read the novel, and she was like, yeah, the movie, which was brutal enough, was not even, like, as brutal and anti-war as the book. Apparently, we're going to talk about Red Dawn more like it's, like a non-torture cinema.
Well, there's a lot to say.
There's a lot of interesting shit about this movie. Like, you guys could have given us Armageddon, and then I would just be, talking about how fucking stupid it is that they decided to, send a bunch of roughnecks into space. But instead, you're gonna hear us talking about, like, imperialism for an hour. Sorry.
Thank you, listeners. Thank you.
Well, I mean, to be fair, like, this film it's an interesting film, and it is interesting in large part because of how much it represents a particular era and the fact that you can't detach it from 1980s, like, US geopolitics. Like, it's just impossible to detach it from that. And so that makes it interesting historically, even if they are, and I suspect Alex would say this with much more aggressiveness, deep flaws in the way that this movie is presented in almost every fashion.
But the 1980s were a very rah West versus East time. I mean, the Cold War wasn't exactly turning hot, but the temperature was spiking.
This film sits with a lot of other films of that era, of this sort of, we should just say it, very jingoistic, like US rah, like we're going to take care of this problem perspective. But that same era is the one that gave us films like The Day After, which is the much more depressing interpretation of what happens in this film, which is, in fact, a nuclear war occurs in World War III, right? There are entire cities that are nuked into oblivion. We don't see them in this movie. Day After shows us in explicit terms. And so I think there's like two pendulums going on at the same moment in the 80s.
And also think about War Games, which came out a couple years earlier, which is about trying to find peace because this stupid computer is going to kill us all. But the computer eventually figures out that no, the only willing move is not to play. So it's like there was a lot going on in the 80s as far as war and stuff going on in this movie mentions Afghanistan, and that felt really weird.
Well, because by then Afghanistan hadn't concluded.
Well, I mean, that the Afghanistan, it's just as much as I hated BBC's Sherlock, just the whole thing about, like, in the original Sherlock Holmes, John Watson is coming back from Afghanistan. In BBC's Sherlock Holmes, John Watson is coming back from Afghanistan. And you're like, fuck. The Graveyard of Empires.
We should get to likes and dislikes, though. And given that I probably am the only one on here that actually likes this movie, I
like this show, I don't like this movie.
I think we'll start with likes and end on dislikes, because I think that'll be more interesting. So, with that in mind, Paul, would you give us your first and only like, please?
Okay, so I'm going to narrow it down. I mean, I could talk about the prettiness of the scene, which I already said, but that's kind of glossing things over. I'm going to narrow it down to a particular incident, even though it's wrong in a way, and I will explain. So I think it's about midway through the movie, we get a couple of Russian officers basically touring the countryside, and they come to a sign for the Arapaho National Forest. Now, as Alex will know, the Arapaho National Forest in real life is in like north central Colorado, whereas this movie is ostensibly set in southern Colorado, so it's the wrong forest. But that's not why I like this, even though I could live with that. They could have put the right national forest on the sign, but that's fine. These Russians are basically acting as tourists, and they're enjoying the sights, and it's pretty country. And they get out, and the only one of the Russians apparently speaks English, and he's asked to translate what the sign says. And the sign is just basically about the Arapaho National Forest, set up in 1905, blah, blah, blah. He comes and spins this entire tale about the sign is about this Indian revolt in 1905 against the imperialist Teddy Roosevelt, and makes up this entire bullshit story that he sells to his comrades, and it's charming. I don't know whether he lies about whether he can read, but he doesn't get Arapaho right. Or he just decides, what the hell, I'm just going to tell a fun story. They won't know the difference because they can't read English. And he spins off this entire fantastic tale. And I was charmed by that. And then they find the arrowhead and then wind up getting into a shootout with our Wolverine friends. But this whole little bit where they're posing in front of the sign and taking pictures and being tourists, and this guy's bullshitting about what the sign says, that little scene was enough levity. They helped me get through this one, because the movie is very serious about how bad the Russians and Cubans and Nicaraguans are. But here we are, the Russians are basically acting as funny goofballs, and until they find the arrow and things go wrong, the scene amused me. It's like,
that was honestly my favorite scene in the entire movie too. I mean, the thing that really that scene, other than that it was just funny, really drove home to me is how different it is watching this movie in the year 2020 than say back in the 80s, where like, you know, when they're talking about Teddy Roosevelt and his imperialist army, current me is like, you say that like it's supposed to be a joke, and yet,
and
yet.
Yeah, I mean, because I recently went to Teddy Roosevelt National Park as part of my Western journey, and the exhibits now and stuff are a little more nuanced than they used to be about who Teddy Roosevelt was and how he treated his presidency and things. I mean, so the culture has changed about thinking about Teddy Roosevelt and who and what he was. I mean, they're thinking about taking one of the statues in the American Museum of Natural History and change some of the things he said in some of the walls. So Teddy Roosevelt has gone through a rethinking since this movie came out. I was joking like, "What, you're making fun of Teddy Roosevelt, one of the greatest presidents ever, who's on Mount Rushmore?" And now it's like, Teddy Roosevelt wasn't the unvarnished good, and I think we all can see that now.
Yeah, there's like an element of that, of like what Alex said, is like, this is said as a joke, but in 1984 it probably plays as like, oh, look at how silly this is, how wrong he gets it. But the longer this film is behind us, the more it's sort of like anybody who actually understands this history is just kind of trapped in this, like, but like, even though he's making all of it up, like, he's actually kind of right. And
right?
So, the only thing he gets wrong, and what cracks me up, is, like, they see the arrow, and, like, his immediate reaction is, oh my god, it's a Native American arrow. Like, they're all going, like, yeah, because they had steel tips and plastic. Like, sure. But he's like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. It's totally true. And it's like, okay, bro, like take the L on this one.
Yeah. I mean, like, it was very, it was just such a weird, like, time capsule of a movie in that way. And in a way, like, thinking about it like that kind of helped me get through it. But the other thing was, you know, when they're in they go to find Patrick Swayze's dad in the quote-unquote re-education camp, and the only, like, clear thing you hear them say over the loudspeakers, I mean, it's a terrible place, and we know that re-education camps exist, etc. But the thing that, you know, the Russians are saying is, like, you know, like, America is this garbage place where the ideals of your founders have been sold by capitalist pigs on the street, and I'm like...
Yeah.
You're not wrong.
And your point?
All right, yeah.
I mean, in that way, like, again, this movie is so much about the time period of it. You know, it is so rooted in the, like, intellectual debate happening about the position of America in the 1980s. And the sad thing is we're somewhat still having that debate now about, like, whether or not we need to actually be considering the roots of America's past and how we think about the future of this country. And, you know, because, like, you could see some of the same arguments being made now where someone's like, well, you know, look at the way that they package patriotism, you know, like, literally after 9/11. Like, the example would be how quickly all these companies came out that sold, like, American flags and other American paraphernalia. You know, the idea that, like, you had to get these because that's what made you really patriotic. I was like, well, but no, these are all opportunists. They're all making money off your patriotism. Like, that's all that exists for. They don't really give two shits about whether or not you're actually patriotic. It's all about, like, no, like, this is an opportunistic time to make money off of your fear, which is not dissimilar than the 1980s, which people absolutely were. So, I do have two other facts that might fit here, though, that are fun, that might tell us something about this era, too, that a lot of people today might not quite understand. Do you want to hear them?
Go for it.
There are two big ones. One is that there is a scene in this, which I thought was really interesting to watch, which may actually be my like, so I may just do it. which is that there's a scene right at the beginning of the film when all the paratroopers are just falling out of the sky, right? And the history teacher or whatever he's teaching.
The thing with the Mongolian stuff, yeah.
Yeah, so he's teaching all this stuff about like the Mongolians, about how the Mongolians work, and Paul will tell you at some other point that that's like really outdated information, but like whatever. But it's like a cool scene, like all these paratroopers are dropping, and it's kind of a natural reaction of like, well, these people, they just must be way off of their marker. Like, what are they doing? Like, it's just some sort of drill, and the teacher goes out and he gets shot. Well, it turns out, like, obviously they had real paratroopers or people that could operate as paratroopers, people who could jump out of an airplane and land. But because, as I'm sure Paul knows, that in terms of how paratrooping works, and Alex, you might know this too, things like weather affect paratrooping. And so there is, in fact, a story about one of the paratroopers who got blown off course by a significant margin. And when he landed, he actually had to convince the locals that he wasn't a real invader because of the way he was dressed.
Oh, no.
So he had to be like, no, I'm in a movie. Like, this isn't real.
Oh, no.
And this is the thing that I think a lot of people today would not quite understand, because we don't talk about paratrooping in the same way anymore. I mean, in a lot of respect, like, we're not doing paratrooping like they did in World War II. It's just like a chute, and you just jump out of a plane and hope you land where you're supposed to. But in 1980s, like, that was a thing. Like, the Russians were using paratrooping as part of their invasive vectors, and the US was using it as a common tactic as well. So it fits that would be a thing that people might actually be afraid of, as if an invasion is going to happen, paratrooping might be a part of it. So, fun fact. That poor guy had a very interesting day. The other fun fact has to do with the tanks in the film, because they did in fact make replica tanks of Russian tanks. And that created a problem because, 1984, as I'm sure both Paul and Alex know a little bit better than me, information did not travel as quickly as it does today. And so when they were ferrying this to a set in order to use it, this replica tank, a couple of CIA operatives actually saw it and followed them, and then asked the set, like, where did you get these? And again, the poor people in charge of this had to explain, like, these aren't actually Russian tanks. These are replicas we've made for a movie. Now, today it wouldn't happen, I think, because this would be just better controlled and there'd be better information. But 1984, like, the idea that the CIA, like, would be sitting around watching, like, yeah. So there you go. Fun facts.
Fun facts. I mean, I was annoyed at some points where they call things that are not tanks. There are tanks in this movie, but they call some APC tanks. And friend of the podcast, Fred Kish, who is a former tank driver in the Army, would bristle at the mention of an APC being called a tank. But that's a sloppiness on the part of the dialogue writers.
That's true. Yeah, this film's fun. But yeah, so my by the way, is in fact the opening paratrooping scene, because I just like that whole framing of that. Like, this movie doesn't, dilly-daddle. It's just like, no, like, invasion's happening. Like, let's just get to
Invasion now.
Like, I think this film just does a good job of, like, yes, it's very serious, but in the way that immediately sets up its premise, it has that opening dialogue that, like, you read and you go, oh, okay, like, World War III's happening. And then it's
the opening titles.
Yeah, the opening titles, which thankfully the movie does not read to us.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Alex, what is your like? Go for it.
So my like, since Paul specifically picked that one scene, I'm going to take the like of the landscape, because as someone from Colorado, I love it every time there's something set in my state, and then I hate it because it never actually looks like my state, because it's normally filmed in like Vancouver. Like, I will say I actually really love Resident Alien. They actually do a really good job for the most part of making it seem like Colorado, but it's filmed in Vancouver, so it's too green.
Wait,
So the thing is, you think I'm going to drag this movie for being filmed in New Mexico, but the thing you need to understand is that northern New Mexico looks a lot like southern Colorado for obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, geographically and how dry it was and all that, it looked great. And, there were beautiful rocks, and they're like, okay, they're so like, and the little town honestly looked like something down in fucking Los Animas County or something. Like, I was really pretty jazzed with how the whole movie looked, as far as the scenery and the landscape and the set dressing and just all of it. I was like, yes, you know, I could totally believe that this is where they say it is, because it looks like southwestern Colorado specifically. Like, the only thing that was a little weird to me is that they had where it looked like it was kind of out past the western slope, like way on the border where you weren't just in the mountains, and then you'd be suddenly in the mountains. So
yeah, they had some bits that seemed like a little too deserty.
Yeah.
For even the drier parts of Colorado, it's like, yeah, that's
but southwestern Colorado is pretty fucking dry. Like,
yes, southern and southwest California is dry. It's true.
So I mean, so I have like honestly no objections on that, and I super enjoyed it, and I was really happy. The only thing that pissed me off is when they were like the Arapahoe National Forest, and I'm like, that's like fucking my backyard. Like, do some fucking research. Look at a map. You want the San Juan Forest.
Yeah, it's one of those things where they could have fixed that by just having it be more accurate to the area that they're actually filming in.
The movie is ostensibly set in a central Colorado pass, so that's why they went with Arapahoe, because that forest is closer to where the movie is supposed to be set, even if it's filmed in northern New Mexico.
Then I have to like spoil my because if it was supposed to be northern Colorado, that did not look like
it's supposed to be more like central Colorado. I forgot to, because it was like some sort of
that was like southwestern Colorado. That's everything was perfect for that. So yeah, they kind of
it's more like south central Colorado. I forgot the name of the town that's supposed to be.
It's a fake town. Who cares?
It's a fake town.
Oh, okay. So I found it. So the name of the fictional town is Calumet, and it's kind of like supposed to be set where Calumet really is, which is kind of like near Poncha Springs, near Monarch Pass. So that's where it's supposed to be set, which is more south central Colorado. So Arapahoe's north of there. So I think that's why they went with Arapahoe rather than, like, say, the Gunnison National Forest. The Gunnison National Forest would have been perfect, because that would have been a much better choice than the Arapahoe.
Yeah, they suck at football there.
Yes.
You know, because that's important as an American pastime.
Well, I will say
they lost their game.
Look, in the Western United States, in the small town, football is actually super important.
That is correct. Yeah, especially when you get closer to the South, like football takes on a whole other meaning.
Oh yeah. Anyway, I liked the scenery. The scenery was really good. There were lots of rocks, and I like rocks.
Oh, nice.
I can add a gentle, like, ancillary, like, that I feel like, in all fairness to this movie, I do want to say that I like that it wasn't entirely misogynist. Like, actually, there is a scene in the film when one of the shitty teenage boys, like, after they pick up two girls, which, I mean, there is a whole, like, gross sort of racist Red Scare, like, oh, the evil soldiers were going to despoil these two girls, so you need to take them and protect them, which is just yucky. But anyway, once the girls are with the Wolverines, none of the boys are shitty or weird to them. It's a weirdly sexless movie in general. The one time the boys are like, one of them's like, oh, go wash my dishes, and the girl's like, go fuck yourself.
Yes.
And then the girls get to, like, murder people too and die gloriously and all that. So I appreciated.
Yeah, because if you look at the end credits of the movie, I mean, the girls look just as militaristic as the boys in those little shots of the characters. So they're not damsel in just. I mean, once they're out of that secret thing underneath the floor, they're not damsels in distress in any way, shape, or form.
Well, I think it's interesting that. So this film does take some supposed reference from World War II, which makes sense because there's apparently like a map at one point which shows 48 states instead of the full 50, which would be a reference to the time of World War II. And there's some production notes that suggest that they may have looked at like Hitler's plans to invade the US or whatever. I don't know how true that is, but it did make me think that with the way that the women participate in the guerrilla campaign that this film presents, reminded me a lot of the Battle of Algiers, the movie, which does feature heavily women actually participating in guerrilla warfare, including a scene in which women participate in the bombing of, I believe in Battle of Algiers, it's a cafe. In this, it's kind of a cafe, but it's like the Russian Cuban.
It's the Russian American Friendship Center.
Yeah, like it's kind of a little bit more on the nose, but. There's that, and then there's obviously the scene where she bombs a tank at one point at a gas station when she's being hounded again by, I think in that case it's supposed to be a Russian guy, but the implication
Yeah,
is
he's supposed to be. Yeah,
the implication is, I think Alex is correct, that like basically all the invading army are thought of as sexual threats. But it's interesting stuff, like the very idea of a guerrilla war campaign, I think is also like very highlighting of the fact that the United States in 1984 is still very much bristling over the fact that it lost the Vietnam War, which it lost it in large part over guerrilla campaigns. So
I noticed you wrote on Twitter that your roommate friend.
Yeah, Karina,
mentioned-
yeah. Because she was like, where are the Vietnam vets? Because you'd think there would be, even in a small town in Colorado, there would be several Vietnam veterans, and they would presumably be the ones spearheading this instead of a bunch of, Lord of the Flies rejects,
But I suspect the reason why is because there's a little bit at the beginning because it's wrapped up with the whole weird politics of this movie that they sort of like, oh yeah, there's a list of people who have guns, we're going to get them sort of thing. It's very early in the movie. So I think that's implied, yeah, people like the Vietnam vets were basically taken out quickly.
Yeah, though it's again, I'm like, how the fuck did the Russians, Nicaraguans, and Cubans know who all the Vietnam vets in this tiny American town are? What the fuck?
I mean, it's a weird thing because on the one hand, this film wants us to believe two things simultaneously, which is it wants us to believe that the adult population of the United States outside of the military is basically ineffectual and just gets like, it's like a YA thing, like the adults are basically useless, right? And this film is taking that kind of like YA approach, which you see in a lot of YA, which is that kids are effectively the responsible ones. They're the ones that have to take on all of the physical action, whereas the
Is
adults...
this a YA movie?
It effectively is.
Effectively,
I mean,
yeah.
It precedes when the category, I think, existed for outside of like children's literature, quote unquote.
Yeah, it's a PG-13 movie. Oh, mind blown! It's a YA.
It's a YA movie. The entire story is centralized around teenagers.
I mean, Patrick Swayze was like 30 at the time when he's playing a 18-year-old. But
you're
still.
just describing the infinite problem with how every like YA movie is meant to be. Like literally everyone in the last Harry Potter movie are supposed to be like 17 or 18, and yet like almost all the actors are in their 20s.
I mean,
like,
look, every fucking like actor in the CW show Riverdale, which is nominally set in a high school, and they're all like hot mid-20s people.
Yeah, I mean, it's like 90210, like fucking everybody in that's like 35. Like, so like, this movie, Red Dawn, is a young adult narrative, and it follows a lot of the common trends that you see in a lot of young adult, which is like the actual adults are ineffective or are taken out in some respect. In this case, they're all imprisoned, basically. And the teenagers are left to figure it out themselves. And when adults do show up to help them, they're largely just there to give them information or stuff. That's basically all they really exist for, with the one exception that there's a kind of creepy, weird, almost romance in this between what is clearly a teenager and like a 40-year-old man.
And I had read that there was supposed to be a romance. There was supposed to be a romance there between Jennifer Grey and that down fire pilot, but they cut it out.
Yeah, they cut it out
for the better.
For the better, yeah.
Yeah, I because that would have really aged the movie even worse than it did if they had gone that way.
Well,
Anyway.
yeah, especially since that we're still having the conversation about like age gaps between actors and actresses in film. And that one is it's a little bit grody. But yeah,
Just
so like, I don't know. There's just a lot to think about with this film. It's an interesting film.
The film itself is not that interesting. The context around the film is actually very interesting.
Yeah, I think
as
that's
a cultural artifact. Because the film itself, I was just like, oh my god, I'm so bored.
Well, this is crazy. So, like, Alex, I don't know if you know this fact, but this film... At the time of its release, held the Guinness Book of World Records for the most violent acts in a movie.
I could believe that, because there is a lot of random shooting. I'm sure we've outdone it since then, but
oh yeah, 100%. John Wick makes this film look like
I mean, RoboCop came after this.
Not
and
that
RoboCop
many years
was
later.
Like bonkers.
Yeah.
All right. It's time for dislikes, and so Paul, I would like you to give me your one dislike. Get to it.
Okay, so, I mean, although it got leavened somewhat, as we've talked about before, there is a heck of a lot of toxic masculinity in this movie.
Woo!
The whole scene between the father and the sons, and it's like, avenge me! It's like,
don't cry no more.
don't cry no more. You're not allowed to cry. And Patrick Swayze is this
Turn it into
it's this
something else.
Hylinian sort of like, I'm in charge and you're not going to cry anymore. You're going to turn those tears into something else. And it's like this is how you turn people into psychopaths. Not how you build a revolution. Or maybe this is how you build a revolution. So it says a lot of bad about.
Like, the one thing I found weird about that scene, because I was actually set to, like, drag it on Twitter when I was, like, bitching about this movie on Twitter. Because, yeah, it was like, don't cry for me anymore, don't you ever cry for me. But then, like, in the middle, they're like, I love you. And Dad's like, I love you too, always. And I'm like, I've got whiplash.
Yeah.
And then,
that's fair. Avenge me. And the women do stand up for themselves. One of the two survivors of this movie, because the movie has a high body count, which actually was my alternate like. The movie is willing to kill its darlings. It's like bros before. I think they even say bros before. I think at one point it's like, what? No.
I mean, yeah, what you're saying is correct. There's a lot of toxic masculinity presented here, and that precedes the war itself.
Yeah, the whole way they're talking about the football game and everything else.
Yeah, because it's important. You got to win the football game.
But also give a slightly different alternate, just like maybe, hopefully Alex would say, like, that history teacher's lecture about how the Mongols' army worked is absolute and positive bullshit.
Oh, yes.
They did not go spreading out in areas the size of Rhode Island and bring things into a net and kill everybody and have the Khan's son be the last person they killed. That is absolute bullshit. That's not how the Mongol armies did anything.
I mean, I also did find it interesting that the bullshit history lesson was given by the one black man in the entire small town.
Right.
Yes.
Which I will admit right now, Southern Colorado is not known for being terribly racially diverse, other than we have, like, it's a lot of white people and Latinos.
And he's summarily killed.
Oh yeah, he just instantly.
I couldn't even think, like, are they trying to make a point about how these paratroopers are trying to surround things? No, I was just like, no, he's just spouting off random nonsense that I knew about the Mongols was wrong back in 1985, much less these high schoolers.
Yeah, and it doesn't have a lot to do with their tactics later.
Yeah, I was waiting for that to, like, have some kind of meaning, and then it never did. It was weird.
It would have made more sense if what they did was actually have a conversation about actual guerrilla war campaigns, because then that would tie into what they do later.
Now, maybe the original anti-war version actually probably went that way.
Possibly.
Maybe. And because, we're criticizing imperialism here, but now that we're talking about, it's like, yeah, America, yeah, we had to switch in, so we're going to switch in to lies about the Mongol army and how they conducted military campaigns. Like, oh, good God. I mean, thankfully it's over and we just get into the rest of the movie quickly, but it rankled because I like my history correct. If I think if I squint there looking at, like, oh yes, the outside invasion, I mean, it's almost yellow perilous in some ways, but then they mention China's on our side. 600 million screaming Chinamen because there's 400 million are dead. It's like, I can't figure out what they're going. It's like, I got whiplash. I was like, who's the bad guys here, really?
We were very, like, China, when they were like, oh yeah, China's on our side, and we were like, really? I mean, I remember the 80s very differently.
Yeah.
Very, very differently.
I wonder if they're trying to self-correct for, like, Russia and, like, the Nicaraguans and the Cubans are all bad because they're commies, but, like, those Chinese commies are kind of okay.
That's why I was very puzzled. I was like, but the Chinese communists, oh, okay?
It doesn't quite make sense, but I wonder if they're just trying to, like, complicate the narrative of, like, this isn't as simple as just the traditional Cold War narrative. And so we need to add, like, a kink in it, but not explain any of it in any way.
I mean, there was a Russian-Chinese rivalry in communist circles for a long while, which is why Nixon tried to open up China. But this movie just does. So why did Russia kill 400 million?
I mean, I don't know. Was the Chinese market a thing even then, where they were like, oh, maybe we'll get?
No, it was
China?
not.
Like, I don't know.
Yep. Let's move on to the next dislike. I think it's you, Alex.
My dislike is the tonal whiplash of this film, because you can see in it where it was supposed to be, like, a dark kind of anti-war film that was an examination of how fucked up everything was. And then that, where it keeps swinging between that and being like, you know, America, fuck yeah, let's blow up some tanks. It was so weird. It was just very uneven. It was very strange to watch, where it was, you could just be like, well, I can tell they fucking rewrote this script. Like,
I mean, you're not wrong that tonally this film is kind of all over the place, and I think that the biggest problem with that is it wants to be a super serious war film.
but its basic concept is so stupid.
It's an absurd concept, but like the actual dialogue and the story
so
that they
bad.
give is not great. That's not helped by, like, some of the actors are also not great. Like,
Oh god, some of the, like, especially some of the teenage boys were
Oh.
just
I think that they want the action sequences to be really exciting, but they're just punctuated by a lot of drudgery
yeah.
that happens around it. Like, there are some interesting scenes that take a place around a fireplace, but a lot of the conversation that takes place is like, there's nothing going on here. Like, this is not, like, that's kind of my reaction. It's just,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although I will say that the Ron O'Neal is he a Colonel Bella?
Yeah.
I loved his character and just wanted more.
He was the most nuanced thing about this entire movie. He was a former, basically ran around with Castro and
Yeah.
helped overthrow Cuba, and then he has that narrative where he's basically writing a letter to his wife, and he misses things. He's like this high, cold, desolate place. Like, he's a guy that got everything he wanted and found that it sucks to won the revolution and now being attacking the U.S. I'd rather be back in Cuba, damn it.
Well, and he respects the revolutionaries, the guerrillas that are the Wolverines, right?
Right, because that's where he came from.
Yeah,
he came from,
that
background.
same perspective, and it's a thing that, like, the other commanders they're all Russian commanders don't understand. Is like, you don't understand the guerrilla mindset, and I actually kind of would have liked a nice back and forth but like, there would have been a nice moment when actually some of the Wolverines actually had to talk to him and have a conversation, because that conversation would have been super nuanced. It would not be as a black and white conversation. It would be like them kind of having a mutual respect while still being on opposite sides of a war. And that would be super compelling, but they don't do that. And I think they just didn't think that maybe we should have an interesting conversation, because they want this to be very black and white. But then they have Bella in this, and he's not a black and white character.
Yeah. I mean, it again, that's like the bones of the old thing that was showing through, because, like, the entire film, if they'd been interested in examining the sort of, you know, all the shit America was doing in Latin America and South America versus, like, you know, then we get invaded and have our own guerrilla war, etc., and kind of looking at the deep fucked upness of that could have been like an actual super interesting film, but
Yeah, he says, we're invading you because you kept messing us for 100 years. That would be a very interesting and very different movie to explore how American imperialism gets paid back in full.
Yeah, because you could still have a movie that's like, war is fucking awful, but, you know, having nuance in there. But this is a movie that was not interested in any kind of nuance.
Well, and that's, I think, the thing I would say is my dislike, which is that, you know, I like it. I actually like this film. I found a lot of it very enjoyable. It's not a film I would say I would go back to repeatedly over and over and over again, because I think a lot of it is very dull. But the thing that I dislike about this is precisely that they removed a lot of the political messaging of its original version, which was meant to be much more of an anti-war film, including the figure of the downed fighter pilot, who is played by, I believe, Powers Booth. Andy is the character, who is meant to be much more anti-war and much more nuanced. He was supposed to be the voice of reason in the conversation, and they reduced his character down to what we get in the movie, which features, like, a vague romance that's super creepy. And I think the problem of this film is that because it doesn't want to have a nuanced conversation, it wants us to be very hoorah, like, yeah, go for it, Wolverines, you're all the good guys, but sort of not giving enough attention to the fact that, like, these kinds of conflicts are horrifically devastating and awful and are things that we don't necessarily want to produce. Because let's be real, if you watch this film with any mindset other than 1984 conservatism, while you don't agree with invasion, you don't necessarily disagree with the reasons for that invasion to exist. Because the realities are that the U.S. Imperial Project in the 1980s is not on the right side of things. They've been fucking up all over in Central and South America, fucking with all these governments, right? That there's all this stuff going. While the Soviet Union's not necessarily a bastion of love and happiness, the realities are that politically, this film is ignoring that, like, fucking everybody is wrong. Nobody is doing the right thing. We're forcing teenagers into a fucked up situation. These kids didn't have anything to do with this. They didn't start this war. They didn't sit down and go like, yeah, let's invade Nicaragua. Like, nobody was thinking. These kids were like, I want to play football and get in my pickup truck and like have some brewskis on the weekend. And yet they've been sucked into this fucked up situation that the film doesn't want to actually address as a thing of like, you're putting the burden of committing acts of war on a bunch of children who don't fully understand the context of what's happening, and nobody is explaining it to them because everybody is so embedded in their ideology that it's no, like, they've attacked America, we got to be super patriotic, kill everything.
It was part of the time and the mindset. So I remember Omni Magazine?
Yeah, I remember.
So there was a speculative fiction article, for lack of a better word, back in around this time period where they described this large terrorist attack against the United States, basically where they basically destroy a lot of infrastructure, knock out power plants and things. And the solution that the guy suggests is basically, let's invade Nicaragua from both sides as retaliation. I remember reading at the time, it's like, wait, what? How does that fix the problems of these power plants and everything else being down? Invading Nicaragua is your answer?
Yeah, I mean, that's the innate conservatism of this film. This film is done with a conservative think tank. It takes a conservative interpretation of this event, and it basically avoids its responsibility to actually address the context of its situation. And while that makes it very interesting as a reflection of its time period, it makes it also a film that very much can only be read within its time period, that you cannot take this seriously outside of that context, because once you do, it falls apart. As a reflection of its period of time, at least we can understand its historical relevance, but it is not a film that makes sense without thinking of a 1980s mindset. I think once you do that, you just lose it. Don't get me wrong, I like this film. I think it's very interesting. I think I'm also very amused by the fact that a whole lot of people watched this movie and went, hey, let's use Red Dawn as a reference for things, including Operation Red Dawn in the Iraq War.
Oh, God. When I read that, I was just like, well, that shows you the place this movie has in the fucking conservative psyche.
They didn't get the message of the film, which, to be fair, the film doesn't help them with. But this is not meant to be this isn't a happy story. All of the revolutionary characters die at the end, basically, with like a couple of exceptions.
Well, but they're martyrs for America.
They're martyrs for America. But, well, okay, we got to close out, because we could talk about this film a lot more, but I want to make sure that we can get close, because Alex will disappear on us and then we will all die.
I will cease to exist.
Yeah, correct.
We can't have that happen.
And so, Alex, if you wouldn't or would be so kind, would you give me your short last thoughts and your grade, please?
My short last thoughts are, this movie was a wasted opportunity, but it's not like, oh, seeing it in 2020 means that it was a wasted opportunity, because we can see all this context, because the movie was originally conceived to be a completely different movie, and it shows. And then, someone from the Nixon administration, who used to be in the Nixon administration, got his little mitts on it, and this is what happened, and now it's a little conservative militia wet dream, which was just really bizarre to watch, where you're just like, do people actually think this? Oh, God.
This is what you want?
Yeah, like, this is the dream you keep having about why you need to have assault rifles, because you think this is, okay. It was interesting as a trip back into the 80s to examine how the culture has shifted over the last almost 40 years. God help us. It was an interesting trip into the conservative psyche that I feel like I need to go wash my hands now. I did not enjoy it as an experience, other than seeing the rocks, because the rocks were really nice.
Okay.
I mean, on the grand scheme of torture cinema, this one was actually, I would almost say this was not a torture cinema film, because obviously we even though we used the framework, we spent most of our time addressing it more like a movie that we watched in a serious fashion.
True.
So
True.
in that sense, I would actually give it a B, because it wasn't bad like most torture cinema movies are bad. It was just like icky, but in a very specific way.
Fair. All right, fair enough. A B for you. All right, Paul. Last thought's great. Go.
Okay, so a lot what Alex said. Interesting scenery, lots of great rocks, lots of scenery. Even though the Arapahoe National Forest is not where this was supposed to be set, I like Colonel Bello as a character. The rest of the characters in this movie have no nuance or depth whatsoever. Rah rah rah. It was an interesting trip back in time to something I had not seen in a long time, or not thought about in a long time, about my own family's history and politics and whatnot. So it was an interesting immersion back into the 80s. And it wasn't torture cinema. It wasn't a great movie. Do I want to watch this again anytime soon? No, I did watch this twice to make sure I was prepared for this one, but I'm not going to be liking this on HBO Max and watching it every week. That's for sure. I'm going to stick with Alex, and I think I'm going to give it a B too.
Awesome. All right. Well, as for myself, I like this movie. Weirdly enough, I'm going to grade it lower than on both of you, but I liked it more than both of you.
Wow.
That's
wow.
so
We
weird.
overshot Sean. That's weird.
Yeah.
So, like, I like a lot of what this film does. I think, Alex, you're right on the money that it really is telling that we talked a lot about the legacy of this film and its periodization and what was going on around the film, because this film is so interesting as a piece of American history. I like the idea of the film, even if the execution is not great. A general feeling that this film doesn't quite know how to be what it is, which I think is really sad for someone who worked on Apocalypse Now, who should know better. With that in mind, I actually would give this a B-.
Yeah, so we average this to just a shade under a B.
Yeah, it's like a B-ish. All right, we've done it. So thanks,
done it.
everybody, for being here. Thank you, Paul and Alex, for coming on. As always, if you'd like to let us know what you thought about this film and what we had to say about it, if you want to let us know your likes and dislikes, skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions, the best way. You can also follow us on all of the socials. We are at Skiffy and Fanty on Twitter and Instagram. We're also on Facebook. You can just look for the Skiffy and Fanty show there. And you can get our newsletter at skiffyandfanty.com/newsletter. And finally, if you really like this show, we could use some love. So there are two ways you could do that. Patreon.com/skiffyandfanty helps us pay for hosting and makes me feel not so bad about all the hours I spend editing. And also 5-star reviews on iTunes will help other people find the show. And if you can't do one of those that involves money, you can also scream about us on the socials and let people know that we exist. As for me, you can find me at Sean Duke on Twitter, Grand Admiral Duke on Instagram, SeanDuke.net, or patreon.com/thejoyfactory.
Aren't you also on Twitch?
Oh, and I'm Alphabet Streams on Twitch if you want to watch me play video games and get, in trouble.
And you can find me, Alex, at Katsu Donbury on Twitter, alexax.com, or at patreon.com/alexax, where I talk about TV, movies, and books.
And you can find me at Prince Justin on Twitter, princejustin.com, patreon.com, that's Prince Justin, and I write lots of reviews and things on blogs and podcasts like Tor.com, Nerds of the Feather, SFF Audio. I'm all over the internet. You throw a rock and you hit something I've done.
Yep, and it's JVSTIN, so instead of a U, it's a V. But otherwise, it's easy to find. Great. All right, now it's time for me to make it awkward. And so I just want you all to know that this episode was actually a recruitment meeting for what will now be the new militia group calling themselves the Wolverines. And Alex and Paul are the inaugural members. So congratulations.
God help us all.
Yeah, you would get a bubble gun at the end of this episode.
Oh,
sweet.
Yeah.
Okay. You're welcome, citizens.
Awkward ending.
Stay frosty.
And see. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.